This happened many years ago. My old friend Pedro and I were getting dressed in our costumes to go trick-or-treating. We started visiting the houses in the neighborhood, like on any normal Halloween night. We reached the oldest part of our neighborhood, the one our parents always warned us to avoid, since we were just two 12-year-old kids and didn't know the area very well. We went to the first house there, and a really nice old lady answered, giving us huge Hershey bars. After that, as we walked towards the second house in that area, a random guy came running and yelling toward us. He appeared from behind a church. At first, we thought it was just a Halloween prank like anyone would, and we stood there laughing. But when he got closer, he tried to grab the pillowcase full of candy I was holding. That's when Pedro started hitting him with his own pillowcase. By that point, we had collected so much candy that the blows must have really hurt. Pedro didn't stop until the guy let go of the pillowcase and ran off. We thought it was over, but as we walked back, we were still completely shocked and confused. I called my mom and asked her to come pick us up because we were far from home, and the whole experience made us want to get out of there as quickly as possible. When she arrived to get us, we told her everything that had happened, and she could hardly believe it because it sounded so absurd. We got home around 10 at night, and shortly after we heard a knock at the front door. My dad figured it was just someone late for trick-or-treating, so he went to answer it. On the other side stood a man wearing overalls and a Michael Myers mask. My dad was a little confused, wondering what this guy was doing trick-or-treating alone. From the man's height and demeanor, it was clear he wasn't a child or even a teenager. Still, my dad handed him some candy and didn't think much of it. While Pedro and I were sitting on the couch, we noticed the man was staring at us, like his mask was pointed directly at us, sitting there in the living room. It made me feel a bit uneasy, and I was hoping he would just leave. My dad ended up closing the door on him when he realized the guy wasn't leaving. It was almost 1 in the morning and we were getting ready for bed. As we were heading upstairs, we heard another knock at the door. There was no way I was opening the door at that hour, and I knew nothing good could come from someone knocking that late. So, I went to my dad and told him about the knock, but he just said to ignore it. Pedro and I went upstairs to my room and turned on a movie. After a while, Pedro heard something and asked me to turn the volume down. When I did, I heard it too. The sound of footsteps on the leaves in the backyard. I looked out the window and saw the man dressed as Michael Myers swinging on our backyard swing, staring directly at my room. My heart raced. It felt like it had leapt into my throat. It was as if he was recreating a horror movie scene on purpose, just to scare us. I ran to my dad's room and told him the man in the costume was in our swing. The look of shock and concern on his face was identical to ours. He looked out the window, but the man had already disappeared. Just as we were looking, we heard another knock, this time at the back door. My dad went to check, but there was no one there. This man was clearly toying with us, trying to scare us. It had to be a Halloween prank. Now even my dad seemed worried. Suddenly we heard my mom scream from the room next door. Pedro, my dad and I rushed upstairs, and there was the man in the Michael Myers costume, standing at the foot of the bed, staring at my mom. My dad told Pedro and me to run and call the police. We raced down the stairs and grabbed the closest phone. I dialed 911 and explained that a man dressed as Michael Myers had broken into our house. The dispatcher asked if everyone was okay. I told her he was upstairs and that my dad was with him, but we needed help urgently. She asked me to stay on the line, saying the police were on their way. Shortly after, we heard my dad yelling from upstairs, followed by the sound of the sliding window opening. We ran back upstairs and found my parents on the floor. My mom was crying, and my dad's nose was bleeding. He said the man had jumped out the window. When the police arrived, we told them everything that had happened as best as we could. They searched the house and the yard, which took about 20 minutes, but they didn't find anything. I think that was my last year trick-or-treating, and honestly, I think it was for a good reason. To this day, I wonder if the guy who tried to steal my candy that night was the same one wearing the Michael Myers mask, and I really regret not telling the police about that part. Halloween has always been one of the days I liked the least during the year. I never had many friends in school, so I never had anything planned for that day. When I was younger, I didn't go trick-or-treating much, And in high school, I never went to Halloween parties. This also happened at a time when my sister was already in college, and since my parents were almost never home, I ended up spending most of my time alone. This was just another one of those Halloweens when I was home alone. The date fell on a Friday that particular year, so there were tons of kids on the streets, and they stayed out later than usual. My parents were out of town that week. My mom had left several bags of candy for me to hand out. I was already a bit tired of the doorbell ringing every 5 minutes all day, so eventually I just dumped an entire bag of candy into a plastic bowl we had stored in one of the kitchen cabinets. My mom wasn't a big fan of the idea of leaving a bowl by the door, but since she wasn't around, what could she do? The strategy worked for a while, and the constant doorbell ringing gave me a break for at least a few hours, and when the candy ran out, I'd refill the bowl. In the end, I wasn't expecting anyone else to ring the doorbell for the rest of the night because, even with the bowl empty, I figured people would get the hint and stop bothering a house without candy. So when the doorbell rang again, I was not only surprised but also a little irritated. I ignored it the first time, but about 30 seconds later, I heard another ring. This time I got up from the computer, paused the game I was playing, and went downstairs to see who was at the door. When I opened it, I saw two guys wearing those white Guy Fawkes masks from V for Vendetta, holding nearly empty plastic candy bags. Neither of them said, "Trick or treat." They just stood there in a somewhat threatening way and raised their bags as if they were expecting more candy. I said, "Hold on, I'll get some more candy." To be honest, I felt a bit intimidated. I went to the kitchen, grabbed a bag of Reese's, and put some in their bags. While I was putting the candy in, one of them, I'm not sure which one, asked me in a strangely monotone voice, "Are you home alone?" I said no, but it came out a bit stuttered because the question startled me. I said my parents were there, wished them a good night, and quickly closed the door. I stood there near the door, trying to listen if they were walking down the steps. After a while, I finally heard their footsteps moving away and felt a wave of relief, starting to head back to my room. But that question, "Are you home alone?" kept bouncing around in my head. I couldn't focus on my game after that. That's when I realized why they might have asked that question. There weren't any cars in the driveway or parked on the street, but the lights were on. So, when I opened the door, at 14 years old, I must have seemed like the easiest target in the world. My paranoia wasn't for nothing because as I was trying to get back to my game, I heard a loud noise coming from the window. I was on the second floor, so it was clear that someone had thrown something at it. My heart started racing. I turned off my computer screen and my lamp to leave the room completely dark. When I looked out the window, I couldn't see anything because of the darkness outside. But then another object was thrown, hitting the window right in front of me. That one scared me even more. It felt like a rock. At that moment, the sense of danger became much more intense. I crouched near the window and left the room. Back then, I didn't have a cell phone, just an iPod Touch, so I had to go to the kitchen phone. I quietly made my way down the stairs, making sure no one could see me through the windows. I reached the phone and dialed 911, but I think they even noticed the little light on the phone because shortly after, I heard a loud bang on one of the kitchen windows. By that point, I was already on the phone with the police, pleading for help, while trying to crawl out of the kitchen, heading toward the back door. When I got there, I started screaming when I saw one of the guys in the V for Vendetta mask trying to open the back door. I was yelling for help into the phone, and almost at the same time I heard a familiar voice calling from the front door. It was our neighbor, Felix. I ran to open the door and he came inside, clearly happy to see I was okay. He took the phone from me and spoke to the police for me. He had seen the two masked men enter my backyard through the kitchen window and watched them throwing various objects at the house. By the time any police arrived, those two masked men clearly knew better than to stick around. Felix invited me to sleep at his house that night, just to be safe. He had been good friends with my dad before we moved, so he didn't mind helping me out. Having good relations with your neighbors could save your life one day. You never know. What I do know is that this experience made me hate Halloween even more. On October 30th, 1975, 15-year-old Martha Moxley went out with a group of friends to participate in what is commonly called Mischief Night. Also known as Devil's Night, it is the eve of Halloween when young people around the world engage in all sorts of pranks, sometimes even minor acts of vandalism. That night, Martha and her friends decided to throw toilet paper rolls over trees and houses, leaving long strands of paper swaying in the wind. To complete the prank, they rang doorbells and ran off, as if warning the residents about the mess they had made. It was harmless fun, though a bit annoying. As they walked around looking for new targets, Martha was seen talking to an older boy named Thomas Skakel. Later that evening, witnesses saw the two exchanging a few kisses, and by around 9:30 p.m., it seemed they had separated from the rest of the group. Martha, holding hands with the boy she was interested in, walked away. The friends left behind thought they were witnessing the start of a romance, but the reality was far darker. That would be the last time they ever saw Martha. The next morning, Martha's mother went down to the yard of their home after noticing something strange under a tree. From a distance, it appeared to be just a pile of clothes. But as she got closer, the brutal reality hit her. It wasn't an over-the-top Halloween decoration. It was the bloodied and severely beaten body of her own daughter. Martha had been attacked so viciously that she was barely recognizable, and there were clear signs that she had been sexually assaulted before her death. Near the body, pieces of a broken golf club were scattered. Martha's killer had not only beaten her to death, but when the club broke, they used the sharp end to stab her. After coordinating with various sporting goods stores in the area, authorities managed to trace the origin of the golf club back to none other than the Skakel family, whose son had been one of the last people to see Martha alive. Naturally, this made Thomas the prime suspect. However, attention shifted when his younger brother Michael made an extremely disturbing confession. Michael claimed that around midnight he had been spying through Martha's house windows from a vantage point in a nearby tree. During this time, he said he overheard Thomas confess to killing Martha with the golf club. Another witness also stated that Michael, who often received preferential treatment due to his family's influence, was once heard saying, "I'm going to get away with murder." 16 years later, the Moxley family hired a private investigator to reopen the case of Martha's death. The result of this new investigation was published in the now famous Sutton Report, which revealed that Michael Skakel's account seemed to change depending on the circumstances, sometimes suggesting guilt, other times pointing to innocence, almost as if he was being carefully coached by the family's lawyers. The report strongly suggested that while Thomas had been the obvious suspect, the true culprit behind Martha's murder was actually Michael. It took over a decade of campaigns and investigations, but in June 1998, Michael Skakel was finally charged with murder, with bail set at $500,000. On May 7, 2002, Michael's defense attorney claimed in court that he was innocent and that he had been at a cousin's house at the time of the crime. However, the prosecution quickly reminded the court that Michael had previously confessed to hiding in a tree near Martha's house, the very same tree under which her body was found. The prosecution then presented the theory that Michael had watched Martha kiss his older brother and, consumed with jealousy, tried to approach her for similar affection. When Martha rejected him, they argued, and Michael, filled with rage, attacked her with the golf club, beating her to death. The prosecutors made such a compelling case that on June 7, 2002, the jury found Michael Skakel guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison at Garner Correctional Institution in Newtown, Connecticut. After his conviction, Michael continued to claim his innocence, and in 2007, his lawyers formally requested a new trial. The request was based on a statement by Tony Bryant, cousin of the late basketball player Kobe Bryant, and a former classmate of the Skakels. Bryant claimed that on the night of Martha's murder, one of his friends confessed to wanting to attack her. Although this claim was deemed irrelevant, it raised enough doubts about Skakel's conviction for the case to be brought before the Connecticut Supreme Court in December 2016. To the Skakel family's great frustration, Michael's murder conviction was upheld by a narrow 4-3 decision, with one judge emphasizing that the verdict had been based on compelling evidence presented by the prosecution. That same judge also stated that, in his opinion, Michael's defense had not been inadequate, and that his conviction reflected his guilt. Despite the initial conviction and the denial of the appeal in 2016, Michael was eventually released from prison. It was decided that he would not face a new trial, but some fundamental questions remain. Is Michael Skakel an innocent man who never should have been imprisoned, or is he a murderer who manipulated the legal system just long enough to secure his freedom? Teresa Lynn Vargas was born on August 9, 1990, and lived in Dickinson, Texas, with her large, loving family. She was very close to her two older sisters, but had a particularly strong bond with her grandmother, whose home was a sanctuary for Teresa when life at home became too hectic. At school, Teresa was a dedicated student with an active social life, so it wasn't unusual for her to come home late, even on school nights. Halloween 2006 was no different. She told her parents she was going to a costume party with school friends, but that was just an excuse. In reality, she planned to meet up with a 19-year-old boy she had been talking to online who was coming to meet her. Teresa was likely excited about finally meeting the boy in person, as they had been exchanging messages for some time. Little did she know that this night would be the last of her life. A few days later, Teresa's body was found by a motorcyclist in a shallow grave, just 200 meters from the school where she studied. When detectives began investigating the murder, the first step was to analyze her phone records. Apparently, Teresa had called the boy she was supposed to meet that night, and a text message indicated that she was having trouble finding the agreed-upon location. This immediately made him the prime suspect, but forensic analysis revealed that he was not involved in the crime. There was no trace of his DNA on Teresa's body. Authorities managed to trace Teresa to a party on California Avenue at around 11 p.m. However, it seems she went to another party on Bramble Lane in Dickinson, where she was last seen shortly after midnight in the company of a man described as older than her. It's unclear who this man was, but it's known that he was one of the last people to see Teresa alive. The authorities' inability to apprehend him reflects the frustrations and failures of this case. Although many details about her death have not been revealed, the police made it clear that there was a strong suspicion of murder. It was later learned that Teresa was brutally beaten, and her funeral was held with a closed casket due to water damage, as her body had been dumped in a drainage ditch. Some people claimed the strangulation marks were among the worst they had ever seen, and when her body was found, a belt was still tightly wrapped around her neck. It was also discovered that Teresa's hair had been cut, which may suggest a personal motivation, or, at the very least, that the killer was disturbed enough to take her hair as a kind of trophy. After local authorities requested that potential witnesses come forward, several people reported seeing a Caucasian man with long, dark hair acting suspiciously near the school on Halloween night. During the searches, a volunteer group found a pair of glasses and a hair tie not far from the drainage ditch, both belonging to Teresa. These items suggest she tried to resist before being overpowered by her attacker. Although the killer's DNA was recovered from Teresa's body almost 15 years later, it still hasn't been used to identify a suspect. It's also worth noting that more than 45 people were interviewed throughout the investigation, but no one has been officially charged with Teresa's murder. On November 1st, 2016, almost exactly 10 years after the crime, the Dickinson Police Department released a statement about Teresa's death. There have been significant developments over the last 10 years, the Post read, but investigators are still seeking more information to give Teresa's family the closure they deserve. The use of the term significant developments is noteworthy, but it's unclear what exactly those advancements were. However, some have suggested that Teresa's case could be linked to a series of other murders that occurred in a grim area ominously known as the Texas Killing Fields. 9 months after Teresa's death, the body of Bridget Guerin was found in Crystal Beach. Crystal Beach is relatively close to Dickinson and is easily accessible via Galveston Island. Additionally, the crime scene bore a disturbing resemblance to Teresa's. Bridget was also beaten, strangled, and sexually assaulted, found without clothing from the waist down near a body of water. Although authorities have not officially connected the two cases, it's plausible to imagine that the similarities in the crimes could indicate they were committed by the same person, given the close dates and geographic proximity of the so-called killing fields. The Texas killing fields cover a 50-mile stretch along Interstate 45 between Houston and Galveston. The area gained notoriety after the discovery of 4 bodies near the Calder oil fields, just a few miles from where Teresa's body was found. Since the 1970s, nearly 30 women have disappeared in that region, a place many describe as a serial killer's cemetery. Due to the area's isolation, some believe that multiple killers have operated there over the years, though only a few crimes have been officially connected. One of those cases is that of Sarah Trusty, a 23-year-old woman whose body was found at the Texas City Dike on June 28, 2002. Sarah was murdered 4 years before Teresa, but the dike is a short distance from Dickinson School. It's very possible that the person responsible for these girls' deaths is the same one who took Teresa's life, but due to limited time and evidence, there's little chance that this criminal will ever be brought to justice. Perhaps this man still lives in the Dickinson area, just waiting for the opportunity to claim another victim. And when that happens, the Texas killing fields may become the final resting place for yet another innocent young woman. On the morning of Halloween 1981, as the sun rose over the convent of St. Francis in Amarillo, Texas, 76-year-old Sister Helena Mendez was peacefully asleep in her small, simple room. On normal days, she would wake up early and head to the chapel for morning prayers. But on that October 31st morning, her absence soon caught the attention of one of her closest confidants, who became uneasy. "I was worried she almost never missed chapel," recalled Sister Angela Marnick. After prayers ended, a few nuns decided to go to Helena's room to check on her. When they arrived, they noticed the door was closed, which was highly unusual as Sister Helena, being deaf, always left her door slightly ajar to hear the alarm. When they finally opened the door, the nuns were not prepared for what they found. Sister Helena lay on the cold stone floor unclothed, with her arms at her sides and a pool of blood around her head. One of the nuns rushed to her aid, but it was too late. Sister Helena had passed away. At first glance, it seemed that the fatal injury to Sister Helena's head had been caused by an accidental fall. In an effort to preserve her dignity, the nuns who found her wrapped her naked body in a sheet and placed her back in bed. As news of her sudden death spread throughout the convent, the young Sister Florentine, visibly shaken, went to the room to say goodbye. While sitting there near Helena's body, something caught her eye and made her shudder. One of the windows was slightly open and the glass was broken. It was then that Sister Florentine realized someone may have broken into Helena's room, suggesting that her death may not have been an accident, as initially believed. After an emergency call from the convent, 2 police officers arrived and conducted a preliminary inspection of the body. During the inspection, the first signs of homicide began to emerge. Severe bruising on Helena's neck, combined with evidence of a break-in, led the officers to believe she had been murdered. Later, a coroner's examination revealed that not only had Sister Helena been brutally assaulted and strangled, but she had also been sexually abused. After analyzing fingerprints collected from the room, police identified the perpetrator, a 17-year-old named Johnny Frank Garrett. During his trial for murder, Garrett denied all accusations, despite overwhelming evidence against him. Pubic hairs found at the crime scene were determined to be a match with his. Additionally, a kitchen knife discovered under Helena's bed was found to be from Garrett's household. While Garrett admitted to breaking into the convent on the night of the crime, he claimed his intent was only to steal. He stated that he entered the convent not through Helena's room, but through the front door, passed through the medicine room, and into the dining hall, where he took the knife. Garrett confessed to entering several rooms, including Helena's, but explained his fingerprints by saying he leaned on the bedpost while trying to reach for a valuable-looking crucifix hanging on the wall. After taking it, he said he immediately fled and returned to his parents' house around 10 p.m. However, one of the nuns testified that Garrett could not have entered through the front door, as it was only unlocked for scheduled visitors. Another nun also disputed the claim that Garrett had stolen an expensive crucifix, since Helena had taken a vow of poverty and owned no luxury items. During the trial, the prosecutor called a psychologist who had interviewed Garrett while he was in custody. The expert described Garrett as severely mentally impaired, stating that he was chronically psychotic. The psychologist also emphasized that Garrett had one of the most violent histories of abuse and neglect he had encountered in nearly 3 decades of practice. The court learned that as a child, Garrett had been the victim of horrific abuse at the hands of his stepfather. This same stepfather would rent out Garrett to other child abusers in exchange for money, drugging and intoxicating him to ensure his silence. Although Garrett's story was deeply tragic, his past was used to reinforce the notion that he was a violent and unstable young man. Combined with the abundant physical evidence, the jury found him guilty of first-degree murder, sentencing him to death in September 1982. Garrett spent the next 10 years on death row until his execution was scheduled for January 6, 1992. However, days before the scheduled date, an unexpected plea arose. Pope John Paul II, the leader of the Catholic Church, reached out to the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles, requesting clemency for Garrett. In addition to his strong opposition to the death penalty, the Pope argued that new evidence was emerging, suggesting Garrett might be innocent of the crime. Despite this, the governor of Texas called a meeting to reconsider Garrett's sentence. Of the 17 board members, none voted in favor of commuting his sentence, and as a result, Johnny Frank Garrett was executed on February 11, 1992, at the age of 28. The violation and murder of a nun is undoubtedly one of the most disturbing crimes imaginable, and it's understandable that the police felt the need to resolve the case quickly to avoid moral panic. But in their rush, could they have sentenced an innocent young man to death? 12 years after Garrett's execution, Amarillo lawyer Jesse Quackenbush took up the mission to prove his innocence. Quackenbush told the press that the new evidence pointing to Johnny Frank Garrett's innocence is so shocking that even the most staunch supporters of the death penalty will be shaken. He sent a letter to the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles, highlighting the many similarities between the murder of Sister Helena and that of Nani Box Bryson, a 77-year-old woman who had been killed just 3 months before Helena in the same part of the city. The man convicted for Bryson's murder, Leoncio Perez Rueda, was already in prison at the time of Quackenbush's investigation, but due to lack of resources, authorities could not formally reopen the case. And even if Leoncio was the real culprit, it would only add a few more years to his already lengthy sentence. The reality of the death penalty is that, once carried out, any chance of redeeming justice for an innocent person vanishes forever. Now, with Leoncio already elderly and nearing the end of his life, it may be too late to uncover the truth about what really happened to Sister Helena Mendez. Perhaps we'll never know for sure who was responsible for her death, but one thing is certain. Anyone capable of murdering and violating a nun in her 70s can be nothing less than a true monster.